Western ethics, utilitarianism. In this video, we will discuss the 9 different kinds of utilitarianism under the Western ethics in Western philosophy. Before beginning with the 9 different kinds of utilitarianism, it is very important that we have a thorough understanding of the concept utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is an ethical philosophical theory according to which an action is regarded moral in nature if the result of that action leads to the greatest well-being or the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. This greatest happiness or greatest well-being for the greatest number of people is the maxim of utilitarianism. In simpler words, according to the theory, a moral action is the one which is more favorable to more number of people. In this sense, utilitarianism is also a form of altruism. As you know, altruism refers to the social well-being of the entire universe. It is similar to the concept of lokasamgraha in Indian ethics. Therefore, the concept of utilitarianism can be said to be similar with the concept of altruism, which is also known as ethical hedonism, where pleasure is regarded as the supreme ideal of life. Thus, utilitarianism believes that the supreme ideal of life is the maximum pleasure for the maximum number of people. The utilitarians do not believe in the concept of individualistic pleasure or pleasure of a single person. They believe in universal or general pleasure. As a result, we can say that greatest happiness of the greatest number of people is correctly their maxim. Utilitarianism is an ethical theory which is a part of normative ethics. Now, normative ethics is a part of moral or ethical philosophy which deals with the study of an ethical action. In other words, what actions are regarded to be moral and immoral in nature are studied under the concept of normative ethics. Jeremy Bentham, J. S. Mill, Sidgwick, Singer, Popper, etc. are some of the famous names of the utilitarians. Also note, the concept stemmed around the 18th century. Now coming to the founder of utilitarianism. The founder of this ethical theory is Jeremy Bentham. Jeremy Bentham is regarded as the founder of utilitarianism, which focuses on the interests of all people equally. It is a version of consequentialism because the moral worth of an action is determined by its result or its consequences or its outcome, and the ends justify the means in consequentialism, which is also applicable in utilitarianism. Simply put, the consequences of an action or the results of an action are the only standard of determining whether the action is moral or immoral in the first place. Utilitarian ethical theory is also known to be teleological in nature. Now, what does this word teleological mean? Teleological simply means purpose-driven. Basically, according to the theory of utilitarianism, an action is determined whether it is moral or immoral on the basis of its result. So, the action is purpose-driven. It basically means that it has to give maximum or greatest happiness or greatest well-being to the greatest number of people. So this is the purpose of an action, whether or not it will be regarded moral or immoral in nature. And this is why utilitarian ethical theory is also known to be teleological in nature. Now, it is important to note that the concept or the theory of utilitarianism stands in stark opposition to the ethical theory which is proposed by Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant proposed the theory of deontological ethical theory, which basically deals with that the actions or the action's morality is not based on its consequences. Meaning, unlike utilitarians, Kant believes that An action's morality or immorality cannot be determined by the outcome or the result of the action. An action is like a duty which has to be performed for its own sake. According to Kant, the moral action is to be regarded as an end in itself. Its morality is not based on the outcome or the result or the consequence of the action. So, this is stark opposite to the ethical theory of utilitarianism. Coming to the first kind of utilitarianism is gross utilitarianism. Gross utilitarianism is also known as quantitative utilitarianism. This is introduced by Jeremy Bentham. According to Bentham, all pleasures are alike in nature. He says, an action is regarded moral if it produces pleasure and wrong or immoral if it produces pain. So the logic is very simple. He believed that pleasure or utility has quantitative differences. This means to say that some pleasures are more and some are less in quantity. For example, the pleasure that I derive from an ice cream is more in nature or is more in measure or utility than the pleasure that I derive from a chocolate. Basically, utility means pleasure and pain are capable of quantification. Hence, they are capable of measurement or measure. So, gross utilitarianism is introduced by Jeremy Bentham, and under this, he also came up with his theory of utility. Coming on to the next one is refined or qualitative utilitarianism. This is introduced by John Stuart Mill. He is also a utilitarian. According to this theory, all pleasures are not alike. Now, this is in stark opposition to gross or quantitative utilitarianism. Mill says some pleasures are more desirable than the others. So, the quality is something which a person should definitely depend upon when talking about utility. So, he believed that pleasure or utility has qualitative differences. This means to say that some pleasures are intrinsically better than the others. Taking the same example of the ice cream and the chocolate, I could say that the pleasure that I derive from an ice cream has a different quality or is qualitatively superior than the pleasure that I derive after having a chocolate. The third kind is negative utilitarianism. Now, this is introduced by Karl Popper. According to him, we should act to minimize suffering or pain and not maximize pleasure. Now, this is totally different to the first two kinds. Here, Karl Popper says that our aim should be maximum pleasure principle should be replaced by the minimum pain principle. So he says, instead of the maximum or the greatest benefit of the greatest number of people, we should aim at the minimum pain to the maximum number of people. The fourth kind is act utilitarianism. This is also advocated by Bentham. Here, according to act utilitarianism, the moral worth of an action is determined by its utility to the people. This basically means how much of a measure does it hold for the people. An action is basically determined on those principles. So Bentham says, morality is an effect of an action that gives maximum pleasure to maximum people because, as we just said, the moral worth of an action is determined by its utility to the people. So when maximum number of people get the maximum number of pleasure, we will regard an action as moral in nature. The fifth kind is rule utilitarianism. This is advocated by Brandt, Hooker, and a number of utilitarians. According to rule utilitarianism, the moral worth of an action is determined on the rule which leads to maximum pleasure for maximum number of people. Basically, the correctness of the rule or the action is determined by the amount of pleasure it brings when it is applied or when it is put in force. Rule is also known as a code of conduct. So basically, rule utilitarianism aims at moral worth of an action is based on the rule followed. That is, it is based on the code of conduct followed in an action. At this point, it is very important to note that rule and act utilitarianism seem very similar in nature, but there is a very fine difference. The difference is the former, that is the rule utilitarianism, is based on intuitive moral rules, whereas act utilitarianism deals with critical or moral reasoning. Like we have just read, it deals with a code of conduct. The sixth kind is ideal utilitarianism. This is introduced by Hasting Rashdall. Ideal utilitarianism rejects that the sole object or the sole motive of a moral action is to maximize pleasure. Basically, according to the Hastings theory, moral worth of an action is based on the values and not on the result or the sole object of the action, which is pleasure, which is commonly regarded by all the other methods. So, according to him, the values must be maximized rather than the pleasure. The seventh kind is preference utilitarianism. It is also known as preferentialism. According to this, moral worth of an action is determined not by fulfilling the greatest pleasure for the greatest number of people, but by fulfilling greatest amount of personal interests. Hence, moral worth of an action is based on the concept of utility, which is defined as individual preference, because it is quite subjective in nature and varies from one person to another. The eighth kind is two-level utilitarianism. This is introduced by R.M. Haar. This theory of two-level utilitarianism is a synthesis of act and rule utilitarianism, which we have already studied. Simply put, according to this theory, the moral worth of an action should be based on rule utilitarianism, except in certain circumstances where it is more appropriate to use act utilitarianism. Basically, it is quite simple to understand it as a synthesis or a combining factor of both act and rule utilitarianism. The ninth and the last kind is average utilitarianism. This is introduced by Henry Sidgwick. Because of its name, it is also known as averagism. Here, instead of maximum pleasure of the maximum number of people, which is the common maxim of the utilitarian theory, average pleasure should be maximized. In simpler words, according to Henry, he values the maximization of average pleasure or average utility amongst people instead of greatest utility or greatest welfare of the greatest number of people. Questions? Dashed form the theory of principle of measure. The correct answer is Jeremy Bentham. Jeremy Bentham founded the theory of principle of utility, which is also called as principle of measure. The correct answer of question number 2 is Bentham introduced gross utilitarianism, Mill introduced refined, Karl Popper introduced negative, and Henry introduced average utilitarianism. Question 3. Pleasure or utility has quantitative differences is accepted by. The correct answer is Bentham. Pleasure or utility has quantitative differences is accepted by Jeremy Bentham. This comes under the theory of gross utilitarianism. Here, it is accepted that pleasure or utility has quantitative differences, meaning some pleasures are more and some are less. Question 4. Values must be maximized rather than the pleasure is accepted by. The correct answer is Rashdall. This comes under ideal utilitarianism. Here, the moral worth of an action is based on values and not pleasure. Question 5. All pleasures are not alike is the view of. The correct answer is John Stuart Mill. All pleasures are not alike is the view of Mill, which comes under refined or qualitative utilitarianism. Mill believes that pleasure or utility has qualitative differences.